That was year 1878, and the prairie stretched endless before them, a vast sea of gold and green that whispered in the wind. The land was harsh, untamed, and ruled by those who could withstand its cruelty. It was no place for weakness, and certainly no place for women left to fend for themselves. Yet that was exactly where Molly, Margaret, and Lillian found themselves. Molly stood at the edge of the dying fire, the embers casting a weak, red glow against the darkness. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and distant pine, the silence so complete that she could hear the rustling of the grass as the wind crept through it. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, but the cold was not what made her shiver. Margaret stirred in her sleep, her face drawn even in unconsciousness. She had barely spoken that day, her normally steady hands trembling as she packed what little food remained. Her husband, Paul, had struck her the night before. Not a slap, but a backhand so hard it had sent her to the ground. Molly had found her with blood at the corner of her mouth, but Margaret had only shaken her head, the same way she always did, refusing to cry. Lillian, the youngest, was curled beside her, lost in some dream that made her brow furrow. She had always been the hopeful one, believing in love stories and promises that were never meant to be kept. When William, her husband, had whispered sweet words to her in their courtship, she had glowed like a child seeing her first snowfall. Now, she hardly spoke of him at all. Molly had never trusted their husbands. They were men shaped by hardship, men who believed a wife was something to be owned, not cherished. John, her own husband, was the worst of them. He had married her because she was strong, because she could cook and mend, because she could survive. But he had never loved her, and when he looked at her now, it was with contempt, as if he regretted every moment they had shared. A twig snapped in the distance. Molly stiffened, heart pounding. But it was only the horses, restless in the night. She turned back toward the wagon, where the men sat, speaking in low voices. The fire between them was larger, warmer. She could just make out John's silhouette, broad-shouldered, the pipe in his hand glowing as he inhaled. The others were with him, Paul, his thin face shadowed in the flickering light, and William, who never met Molly's eyes for long. They were planning something. She had seen it in the way they moved, in the way they had stopped speaking when she approached earlier. Something was wrong. Molly knelt beside Margaret and shook her gently. "Wake up." Margaret groaned softly, blinking up at her. "What is it?" "Something's wrong," Molly whispered. "I don't trust them." Margaret sat up slowly, rubbing her arms. "You never trust them." Molly glanced toward the wagon again. "This is different." Lillian mumbled in her sleep, turning away from them. Molly hesitated, then shook her too. She woke with a start, eyes darting around. "What's happening?" "Get up," Molly said. "We need to listen." They crept toward the shadows, close enough to hear the men's voices, but far enough to remain hidden. The fire crackled, masking the sound of their movements. John's voice was low, but there was no mistaking the cruelty in it. "They'll slow us down. They'll get us killed," Paul added. William shifted, the hesitation clear in his tone. "But if we leave them here—" "They'll die," John finished. He took a long drag from his pipe, exhaling smoke into the night. "That's not our problem." Margaret let out a soft gasp. Molly grabbed her wrist, squeezing tight. The world tilted, the weight of their words sinking in. Their husbands, men they had followed across the country, men they had once trusted, were leaving them. Lillian's breath came fast and sharp beside her. "They wouldn't." "They would," Molly whispered, her voice like stone. The men stood. John kicked dirt over the fire, smothering it. "We leave before dawn." Paul stretched, rolling his shoulders. "And the women?" "We take the horses, the wagon, and supplies," John said. "Let the prairie deal with them." William hesitated again. "Lillian." John cut him a glare. "She's not your problem anymore." Molly pulled the others back into the darkness. Her heart slammed against her ribs. They had to move. Now. Margaret clutched her wrist. "What do we do?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Molly's mind raced. They had no weapons, no food, no way to outrun the men, not on foot. The prairie stretched wide and merciless in every direction, an unbroken expanse that could swallow them whole. "We need to take the horses," she said. Margaret's eyes widened. "They'll hear us. They won't if we're careful." Molly looked at Lillian. "Can you do it?" Lillian hesitated, then nodded. She had always been light on her feet, always slipping away from their husbands when they were in foul moods. If anyone could do it, it was her. Margaret grabbed Molly's hand. "And if we don't make it?" Molly met her gaze. "Then we die fighting." They moved quickly, crouched low as they neared the horses. The animals snorted softly, shifting their weight. Molly ran a soothing hand down the neck of the nearest mare, whispering calm words. Lillian reached for the reins. A sharp sound cracked through the night, a boot scuffing against stone. Molly turned just in time to see John standing behind them, rifle in hand. He grinned, slow and mean. "Going somewhere?" Lillian let out a strangled cry as William grabbed her, dragging her back toward the wagon. Margaret tried to run, but Paul seized her arm, twisting it behind her back until she gasped. Molly lunged for John, but he struck her across the face with the butt of his rifle. She hit the ground hard, her vision flashing white. Dirt filled her mouth, the taste bitter and cruel. John crouched beside her, gripping her chin and forcing her to look at him. "You always were a stubborn one," he said, almost admiringly. Then he shoved her away. The world spun. Molly could hear Lillian sobbing, Margaret's breath coming in short, sharp gasps. John stood, dusting off his hands. "Time to go, boys." The men mounted the horses. The wagon creaked as it rolled forward, wheels cutting deep into the earth. Lillian screamed William's name, but he never looked back. Margaret fell to her knees, watching the last of the light fade with them. The night swallowed the sound of hoofbeats, leaving only the wind. Molly pushed herself upright, pain lancing through her skull. Her lip was split, blood warm against her chin. She stared into the darkness, her breath slow and steady. Margaret sobbed beside her. "They left us." Molly swallowed, wiping the blood from her mouth. "I know." Lillian knelt in the dirt, her hands fisting in her skirt. "We're going to die." Molly looked at her, at Margaret, at the vast, merciless expanse before them. Then she lifted her chin. "No," she said, her voice strong. "We're going to survive." The wind howled, carrying their promise into the night. The night stretched long and merciless, the cold creeping into their bones as they sat huddled in the grass, listening to the wind whisper through the endless expanse of prairie. No fire, no food, no shelter, only the bruises left by their husband's betrayal and the grim understanding that survival would not come easy. Molly pressed a hand to her temple, wincing as the dried blood cracked on her lip. The pain was nothing compared to the weight in her chest, a dull ache of fury and disbelief. Margaret sat beside her, arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she could hold her broken world together through sheer will. Lillian shivered, her breaths uneven, her face a pale mask of fear. The silence between them was thick, but there was no need for words. The reality was plain. They had been left for dead. The first streaks of dawn crawled over the horizon, painting the land in a weak amber glow. Molly forced herself to her feet, muscles stiff, body aching from the night spent on the ground. "We need to move," she said, her voice hoarse. "If we stay here, we die." Margaret lifted her head, dark circles carved under her eyes. "Where?" Her voice cracked. "There's nowhere to go." "There has to be something," Molly insisted. "Water, shelter, people." She hesitated on the last word. People could be just as dangerous as the land itself. Lillian let out a bitter laugh, sharp and hollow. "Even if we find people, who's to say they won't be worse than the ones who left us?" Molly knelt in front of her, gripping her shoulders. "We don't have a choice." She glanced toward Margaret, her voice softening. "We have to try." Margaret nodded numbly, but Lillian still looked unconvinced. In truth, Molly wasn't sure herself. But she couldn't let them see her doubt. She had to be strong for them, had to be the one who kept them moving. They started walking. The land stretched endless before them, wild and empty. The sun climbed higher, turning the prairie into a vast furnace, the heat pressing down on them until sweat soaked their dresses and their mouths turned dry as dust. The wind, once their only companion, now tormented them with whispers of water that did not exist. Hours passed. Their steps grew slower, their legs heavy. Lillian stumbled, and Molly caught her just before she hit the ground. "We have to keep going," she murmured. Lillian shook her head weakly. "I can't." Margaret wiped her brow, her skin flushed. "Molly, we have to stop." They collapsed under the meager shade of a crooked tree, its gnarled limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers. Margaret sagged against the trunk, her breaths coming fast and shallow. Lillian curled on her side, eyes half closed. Molly forced herself to stay upright, scanning the horizon for anything that could mean survival. Then she heard it, a distant rustling, rhythmic, unnatural. She tensed, her heart pounding. Someone was nearby. The sound grew louder. Horses. More than one. Panic surged through her. They had no weapons, no way to defend themselves. If it was their husbands returning, they wouldn't be so merciful this time. If it was someone else, she had no way of knowing whether they would offer help or harm. The figures appeared at the crest of the hill, silhouetted against the sun. Horsemen. Their forms were tall, lean, draped in buckskin and adorned with beads and feathers. Lakota. Molly's breath caught in her throat. She had heard of them, had listened to settlers speak of their raids and their warriors, of their fierceness in battle. But she had also heard whispers of their honor, of the way they protected their own, of their deep, unshakable connection to the land. And now they were here. The leader was the first to approach. His black hair was long, bound with leather, his eyes sharp and unreadable as they swept over them. His horse shifted beneath him, powerful and restless. Molly did not move. Behind him, two others watched with equal intensity. One was older, his face lined with wisdom, his presence steady as the earth. The third was younger, his features full of fire, his body coiled with energy. They did not speak at first. The leader's gaze flickered from Molly to Margaret, then Lillian. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something there, curiosity, perhaps, or pity. Molly swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand despite the weakness in her limbs. She raised her hands slowly, carefully. "We mean no harm," she said, her voice rough from thirst. The leader studied her, his eyes flickering over the bruises on her face, the state of their torn dresses, the desperation in their stance. Finally he spoke. The words were not English, but the tone needed no translation. A question. Molly hesitated, then tried again. "Husband's gone," she said, gesturing to the empty horizon. "Left us. No food. No water." Silence. The young warrior snorted, muttering something to the others. The older one merely observed. The leader's gaze remained locked on Molly's. There was something measuring in his expression, something she could not decipher. Then, without a word, he dismounted. Molly tensed, but he only reached for the water skin at his hip, tossing it to her. She barely caught it, fingers trembling as she fumbled to open it. Water spilled over her lips as she drank, the relief so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. She handed it quickly to Margaret, who did the same, and then to Lillian. The leader turned to his men, speaking in low tones. The younger one scowled, shaking his head, but the older man nodded. Then, the leader looked back at Molly and gestured toward his horse. She understood. He was offering help. She hesitated. Could they trust them? But what choice did they have? Molly nodded. The older warrior helped Margaret onto a horse, his movements gentle, patient. The younger one, clearly reluctant, offered his hand to Lillian. She hesitated, but eventually allowed herself to be pulled up. Molly moved toward the leader's horse, glancing up at him. He gave a single nod before reaching down, gripping her wrist with firm fingers, and pulling her up behind him. The horses turned, carrying them away from the endless, empty horizon. The journey was silent, but it was not uncomfortable. Molly held on as they rode, the land blurring past. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was not sinking deeper into hopelessness. She glanced at the man before her, the leader, the one who had made the choice to take them in. Who was he? And why had he helped them? The questions burned in her mind, but for now, she let them rest. Because for the first time in days, they were not alone. The Lakota village lay nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and towering pines. Smoke from cooking fires curled into the morning sky, the scent of roasted meat and fresh earth mingling in the air. Children ran barefoot between the lodges, their laughter bright and carefree. Women moved with practiced grace, tending to food, sewing, grinding corn. It was a world the sisters had never known, one so different from the rigid, brutal existence they had left behind. Molly had not yet decided if they had traded one prison for another. They had been given shelter, a small lodge at the edge of the camp, separate but not unwelcome. The leader of the warriors, the one who had pulled her onto his horse and carried her away from certain death, had brought them here without explanation. He had spoken few words, but his presence lingered, watching, waiting. She had learned his name from hushed voices around the fire. Chaska. Margaret remained quiet, her hands moving absently over the borrowed blanket draped over her lap. The dark bruise along her cheek had begun to fade, but the fear in her eyes had not. Molly had watched as a Lakota woman, older, with kind eyes and strong hands, had brought her herbs, pressing them into her palm with a reassuring nod. Margaret had accepted them, but had yet to speak a word of gratitude. Lillian, restless and unwilling to remain confined, had wandered beyond the lodge, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Molly had found her by the river's edge, watching the younger warriors train with their bows. One in particular had noticed her, Hoda, the one with the fire in his eyes, the one who had seemed least pleased to take them in. He had not spoken to her, but he had smirked when she tried to mimic his stance, drawing an imaginary bowstring. When she had turned away, he had loosed an arrow into the sky, its path clean and perfect, as if to remind her that she was no match for him. Molly did not yet understand their place here. Were they guests? Burdens? Prisoners? Chaska had not answered when she asked. Instead, he had watched her, his expression unreadable, before handing her a bundle of dried meat and gesturing toward the fire. It had been a simple act, but it had unnerved her. Her husband had never brought her food unless it was expected of him. His kindness had always been an illusion, a trick used to make her believe he was something more than what he was. She had learned to be wary of men bearing gifts. Yet, Chaska had asked for nothing in return. Days passed, and the sisters began to settle, though unease remained like an unspoken warning between them. Margaret had taken to sitting outside the lodge, watching the village with silent eyes. Lillian explored cautiously, never straying too far, her laughter gradually returning in quiet bursts. Molly remained on edge, waiting for the moment when the kindness they had been given would be stripped away. The first true test came with the arrival of another group of warriors, men who had been gone on a hunt, their return marked by cheers and celebration. Among them was a man with cruel eyes and a mouth twisted in suspicion. He saw Molly first, his gaze lingering before he turned to Chaska, speaking quickly in their language. Molly knew enough to recognize the warning in his voice. The argument was brief but heated. Chaska remained calm, his posture relaxed but firm. The other man did not seem convinced. Molly could feel the weight of his gaze on her, heavy with something she could not name. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the village. Later that night, as the fires burned low, Chaska approached. Molly stood, instinct tightening her shoulders. What did he say? Chaska considered her for a moment before answering. He does not trust you. It was the most he had spoken to her since their arrival. His voice was steady, deep, measured. Molly folded her arms. Then why did you bring us here? For the first time, something flickered in his expression, an emotion she could not decipher. Because you would not have survived. She held his gaze, searching for deception, for any sign that he was no different from the men she had known. But she found none. A long silence stretched between them before he spoke again. You are safe here. Safe. She did not know if she remembered what that felt like. Days bled into weeks. The Lakota did not push them away, but nor did they demand anything from them. The sisters were left to find their place, to learn, to heal. Margaret, hesitant but willing, had begun to help the women prepare food, her hands finding familiarity in the rhythm of kneading and stirring. Lillian, emboldened by curiosity, had taken to following Hoda, challenging him in ways that made him scowl but never truly angered him. Molly remained watchful, wary of the ease with which their world had shifted. And yet, there were moments when she allowed herself to forget. She forgot when she sat by the river, watching the water move in endless patterns, its song soothing in ways she had never noticed before. She forgot when Chaska stood beside her, silent but present, the weight of his presence strangely grounding. She forgot when one night, beneath the wide expanse of stars, he handed her a bow. She hesitated, looking up at him. He gestured for her to take it. "You should learn." Molly did not ask why. She only nodded, taking the weapon in her hands. Chaska stepped behind her, adjusting her grip, his touch light but sure. "Here," he murmured, guiding her fingers to the bowstring. "Like this." She swallowed, ignoring the warmth of him so close, ignoring the way his voice sent a strange shiver down her spine. She focused on the bow, on the way it felt in her hands. "Steady," he said. "Breathe." She loosed the arrow. It did not fly straight, but it flew. Chaska gave a rare smile. Again. She tried again, and again. She did not notice when the stars began to fade into the coming dawn. She did not notice when, for the first time in her life, she did not feel powerless. But peace was a fragile thing. It was late when the shouting began, the voices rising in anger, the tension thick enough to strangle. Molly emerged from the lodge, her stomach twisting. The man with the cruel eyes stood near the fire, gesturing wildly, his voice sharp. Chaska stood across from him, his face unreadable. Molly did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning. They did not belong. Chaska turned then, meeting her gaze across the fire. Something unspoken passed between them. And then he spoke a single word. "Stay." Molly had spent her life obeying men who did not deserve her submission. But this was not an order. It was not a demand. It was a choice. And for the first time in her life, she chose to trust. The sky darkened with the promise of an approaching storm, heavy clouds gathering at the horizon like a rolling tide. The air carried the scent of rain, thick and electric, but the tension in the village had nothing to do with the weather. Molly stood at the edge of the firelight, her heart pounding as she watched the argument unfold. The man with cruel eyes, Maddo, was shouting, his words laced with anger and distrust. Chaska remained calm, his stance firm, unyielding. The people gathered, murmuring, watching with guarded expressions. Molly understood enough now to piece together what was happening. Maddo believed they did not belong. The white women should not be here, he argued, should not be trusted. They were the enemy. Chaska did not flinch. He met Maddo's rage with measured words, a wall against the storm. His voice was steady, low but commanding. Molly could feel eyes on her, judging, questioning. Margaret and Lillian were behind her, tense and silent. Hoda stood near them, his jaw clenched. Even he, who had been reluctant to accept them, seemed unwilling to see them cast out like animals. And then a sound cut through the night. Hoofbeats. Distant at first, but unmistakable. A chill ran down Molly's spine. The fire crackled, throwing shadows against the lodges as the warriors turned toward the hills. The sound grew louder, closer. She knew that sound. It was the sound of men coming with violence in their hearts. Chaska's expression hardened. Maddo, for all his anger, turned his head sharply, his posture shifting from accusation to readiness. The riders emerged from the darkness, their shapes cutting through the storm-lit sky. Molly's stomach twisted. She recognized them before she saw their faces. John, Paul, William. They had returned. She did not know if it was to reclaim them or to finish what they had started, but the sight of them filled her with a kind of terror she thought she had left behind, the kind that froze the body and stole the breath. But she would not be frozen this time. Chaska stepped forward, his voice cutting through the wind like a blade. The warriors behind him shifted, hands tightening on their weapons. The Lakota did not fear these men. They were ready to fight. John dismounted first, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He had the same smirk, the same cold eyes. "Figured you'd run off somewhere," he said, his gaze settling on Molly. "Didn't think you'd crawl to the savages." Molly lifted her chin. The fear still sat in her chest, but it did not control her anymore. Paul spat on the ground, his lip curling. "Time to come home." Margaret made a strangled sound behind her. Molly could feel her sister trembling, but she didn't turn. She didn't move. Chaska took another step forward, his presence beside her solid, unshaken. "She is not yours," he said in perfect English. The words hung in the air like a challenge. John let out a short, bitter laugh. "She's my wife." Molly did not know when she had started shaking, but her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Chaska had not looked at her, had not asked her permission to speak for her, but somehow she knew, if she told him no, if she stepped away, he would not hold her back. It was her choice, and she had made it long ago. "You left me," she said, the words tasting of steel. "I am not your wife." John's smirk faltered. Paul's fingers twitched toward his gun. Molly's pulse roared in her ears, but she did not move. And then everything happened at once. John reached for her. Chaska moved faster. The world exploded in motion, shouts, the clash of bodies, the crack of gunfire. Molly barely had time to react before she was shoved backward, out of a line of fire. She hit the dirt hard, rolling to her hands and knees. Margaret screamed. Lillian scrambled away as Hoda lunged past her, his knife flashing in the firelight. Molly's breath came fast, ragged. She pushed herself up, searching. John was locked in a brutal struggle with Chaska, their bodies twisting in the dirt. Chaska had the advantage, stronger, faster, but John was desperate, wild with rage. Paul fired his pistol into the chaos. A warrior went down with a sharp cry. Margaret gasped. Molly did not think. She moved. She grabbed a fallen knife, its blade cold in her hand. John had Chaska pinned, his fist raised, ready to strike. Molly lunged. The knife sank deep into John's side. His body jerked, his breath hitching. For the first time, his eyes widened with something like surprise. He turned his head, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. Molly did not let go. John staggered back, his grip on Chaska loosening. Chaska reacted instantly, rolling free, kicking him away. John collapsed to his knees. His hands pressed to the wound, blood spilling between his fingers. Molly's chest heaved. Her grip on the knife tightened. Paul saw. His face twisted with fury. "You bitch." An arrow struck him in the throat. He fell without another word. Molly's gaze snapped to the source. Lillian stood there, her hands trembling around the bow. Hoda was beside her, his expression unreadable. The storm broke. Rain fell in heavy sheets, washing away the blood, the dust, the fire's embers. John choked, his body shuddering. Molly stood over him, watching as the life drained from his eyes. She felt nothing. Chaska rose to his feet beside her, his breathing even, steady. He said nothing, but when he looked at her, there was no shock, no condemnation, only understanding. It was over. The other men had fled, those who could. The warriors stood victorious, their camp intact, their people safe. Molly let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The storm raged, but for the first time, she did not feel trapped in it. She turned, searching for Margaret. Her sister stood motionless, staring at Paul's body, the rain washing the tears from her face. Then, slowly, she turned her gaze to Molly. Margaret took a step forward, then another, and she fell into her sister's arms. Molly held her tightly, her own tears mixing with the rain. Lillian let out a broken laugh, wiping her face, her bow still clutched in her hands. Hoda watched her, shaking his head, but there was something close to pride in his eyes. Chaska stood beside Molly, silent, waiting. She turned to him. The firelight flickered between them, the storm casting shadows across his face. Molly lifted her chin, looking into his eyes. He did not ask. She did not speak. She had made her choice, and this time it was truly hers.